Hello, chess fans. I'm Sam Copeland, and I'm a national master on the content team here at Chess.com. Today, I'm here to show you the exciting game between Etienne Bacrot and Hikaru Nakamura from today's Pro Chess League playoffs match. In this exciting position, Hikaru sacrificed his bishop on g7. Let's see how we got to this critical moment. Bacrot chose to open up the game here with knight to f3, and the game develops with relatively natural play, and after Hikaru in a moment captures here on c4, we're getting a structure that looks a lot like a queen's gambit accepted here, very standard structures, although white has temporarily at least refrained from d4. Now after pawn to a6, Hikaru commented on stream that he thought that he'd actually played a game against Bacrot in this structure before, in this position in fact, and that was in a rapid tournament in Geneva. Now, I actually looked up that game. It was a little bit different, but the structure was similar, and ultimately, Bacrot committed to a kingside attack that faltered, and he lost the game to Hikaru. That theme is going to be similar to the theme that we see in this game. The game continues naturally with very typical moves from both players. Ultimately, Hikaru plays c5, achieving what is an essential break here in these structures, and then we're going to see an exchange on d4. So now we have an isolated queen pawn for white here on d4. Now this is very, very typical. Black theoretically has a structural advantage, has a nice outpost on d5 in front of the isolated pawn. But on the other hand, white has a typical space advantage and some initiative. This makes sense if Bacrot is trying to press for a win here, and it does seem from his play that he is choosing to play aggressively. So bishop e7, rook d1, castles, and bishop f4. Hikaru commented on stream that this was a little bit odd. The bishop does seem slightly unusually placed here, and the computer is calling for bishop g5, which is a more typical location for the bishop in these isolated queen pawn positions. It's putting pressure on this piece that is helping to blockade that d pawn. So anyway, in this game, bishop f4 did happen, knight d5 now hitting that bishop, and the bishop falls back to g3, a slightly odd location, but it is eyeing this diagonal here and the potentially useful c7 square. In optimistic scenarios, it is possible for white to invade along the c file. That is an open file. Knight c6 here, and we see an exchange here on d5. This transforms the structure here. Now it's symmetrical, and you might think that when we get a symmetrical pawn structure, then the position's pretty much equal. The players should agree a draw soon, but there are multiple reasons that's not the case. One, it's a rapid match, so you should never think that the game is a dead draw. There's always going to be opportunities in faster play for players to go wrong. And also, in this case, I think this bishop is actually fairly bad because of the pawn on d5, so white should have some advantage here to be able to press for quite a while. The bishop falls back to d3, knight b4. Of course, you're going to preserve the bishop pair, so bishop b1. And it's around here that I think Hikaru is realizing that a lot of his ideas aren't actually that effective, and white does have an idea here of bringing this rook up and swinging it over to the king side to create quite a potent attack. At this point, Hikaru was commenting on stream that he was under pressure and that he didn't really feel like he'd played this entirely correctly. Bacrot drops this knight into e5, certainly looks like a beautiful knight, and Hikaru plays g6, which I think supports an eventual pullback of this bishop, and more importantly, it's blunting the bishop here on b1, which can be quite dangerous. Rook a3, that rook is thinking about swinging to all kinds of potential open lines, even as far as h3 over here to participate in a strong kingside attack. Now bishop a6 hitting the queen moves over to d2, staying in touch with these dark squares. Rook c8, bishop f4 here, that frees this line for the rook to fully swing over, and after bishop f6, the rook does exactly that. But this is an overcommitment. In fact, rook h3 I think is a fairly significant mistake, and the next few moves are really interesting and critical. I think the players were still playing relatively quickly. Again, rapid game. The time control was 10+2. So in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily that important that you play exactly the right move as long as you're playing a good move quickly. Rook h3, though, does misplace the rook here. It has an idea to potentially try to introduce the queen into h6 if the bishop can get out of the way, and there could be mating ideas, but that's a little bit pie in the sky. Hikaru is never going to allow that, which means that the rook can be misplaced all the way over here. It can really end up sidelined. In fact, a better way to try and conduct the attack on the dark squares was either knight g4, which is pretty nice, or bishop h6 here, and both would give a pretty clear advantage to Bacrot and lots of nice opportunities to attack. So in any case, rook h3 does happen. A game that I can recall that reminds me a lot of this kind of rook lift and the risks that are associated with his overcommitment here is the game Rajabov versus Anand. And I'll include a link in the card up in the corner of this video where you can check that out if you want. It's really very similar, and I think that honestly a rook on h3 is often one of the worst placed pieces if the attack doesn't break through very, very quickly. There are lots of examples in chess literature where when the attack falters, this rook ends up massively misplaced. In this case, we see rook e8 from Hikaru, and now a very aggressive move from Bacrot. He plays bishop to g3. Better was something like rook e1 or even rook e3, repositioning and saying, all right, I'm not going to checkmate you, but I'll center my rooks and I'm doing pretty well. After bishop g3, of course, the rook is really stuck here on h3. There's the immediate idea here, which would win, but this isn't a bullet game, and Hikaru probably wouldn't even miss this in bullet. So he pulls back with bishop g7. The bishop is nicely placed here. No invasion is possible here on h6. And there starts to be an idea of pawn to f6 to push that knight back. And what we're starting to see now is that Hikaru is more centralized in this position. There start to be back rank problems for Bacrot. I'm not saying that Hikaru is better yet, but I think it's becoming harder to play Bacrot's position than Hikaru's, and Hikaru's pieces are starting to make more sense. In fact, in this position, probably what made sense was doubling back, admitting you made a mistake and playing bishop f4. It's really hard, even for the best players in the world, to play a move like bishop g3 and then say, whoa, bad idea, and go back to f4, but that would be a way to reintroduce harmony and connect this rook again. Another interesting idea was bishop h4 here, trying to swing this bishop out of the way and get the rook back in. But one problem there is that rook e3 here, which is natural, runs into bishop h6 with a skewer. So you're starting to see some of the problems in the white camp. Another interesting idea worth mentioning was going all in for the attack. This would be a way to justify the rook's placement on h3. This is knight takes f7. Now, after king takes rook takes h7, you do get 2 pawns for the piece. And also there is some pressure here against g6. But this feels like a bit of an overcommitment from white. It doesn't feel like there's enough pieces to finish off the attack, and sure enough, the computer points out good resources. For example, rook e2 is a nice invasion supported by this bishop here, a check, and the king falls back. And yes, you can win this pawn here. You even get 3 pawns for the piece, but queen f6 offering a queen trade really leaves white with no way to try and deliver checkmate here, and black's pieces are a lot more active. I think black is for choice here. Hikaru would have been very happy with this transformation. So in the game, after bishop g7, we saw queen f4 from Bacrot, and actually the strongest move here was queen e7, which piles up on this knight. It also defends f7. There are a lot of back rank problems that Bacrot needs to worry about, and I think this provides a very big advantage for Hikaru. Moves like f6 and knight c6 are hard to meet. Instead, Hikaru played the simpler but also good queen f6, offering a queen trade, and probably best was actually avoiding that queen trade, keeping more chances for Bacrot, but he did go for the queen trade. Queen takes f6, bishop takes f6 here. And now, again, I think because he's more centralized and he's in control of the open files, this is a nice advantage for Hikaru. He can press here without really any issues. Bishop f4, the bishop does admit the mistake of being placed on g3, and the rook is reconnected along the third rank here. Now, a good move for Hikaru could have been knight c2. Really nice here because probably you're going to need to give up the bishop pair and take on c2 when black's rook is also super strong. A big threat that knight c2 introduces is knight takes d4 when there are both back rank problems for white to watch out for, and knight takes d4 will remove a critical defender of this knight, which could allow you to win a pawn and maintain a strong position. So knight c2 was a nice move in this position. In the game, after bishop f4, bishop g7 from Hikaru, intending pawn f6, kicking that knight out when this rook regains a lot of scope. Rook c3 offering one rook trade and contesting at least one of the open files that black is controlling. Pawn f6 kicking that knight, and the knight falls back here, but stronger and probably the last chance Bacrot had to maintain something like balance in the game was knight d7. This is very sharp, but the idea is to focus in on the b6 pawn, which is just about the only vulnerability Hikaru has here, and this would allow Bacrot to maintain the balance or something close to it, though it's still tricky, and the knight could end up trapped over here after taking on b6, though the computer seems to think, presumably rightly because it's the computer, that bishop c7 will avoid the loss of the knight in any critical variations. So pawn f6, and the knight chooses not to go into d7, not to risk getting trapped, falls back to f3 here. Bishop e2 is a nice move here, and then we get rook c1, forcing a trade of rooks here. Now, instead of taking here when the doubled pawns really aren't a problem for white, much stronger was what Hikaru played, knight d3. Now we have a bishop pair for black. That does matter here. Black is in control of the only open file, and likely what is at some point going to happen is that this pawn is going to be lost because it is vulnerable to attacks from this bishop and from this rook. And when that pawn is lost, probably white's best is going to be to win b6. The mutual weakness of these pawns almost guarantees their exchange at some point, and when they're exchanged, then Hikaru is going to have a passed a pawn, and that is going to be very likely to win the game. It's hard to say that this position is objectively winning already, but there's a lot of pressure for Bacrot to deal with and a very clear winning plan for Hikaru. So knight e1, hitting that bishop. The bishop falls back to f5, headed for this square to attack that pawn. Bishop e3, bishop d7, rook a1, rook c8. The play is so easy for Hikaru right now. He's just maneuvered his pieces to hit a4. Sure enough, Bacrot now needs to go after b6, so he does, and we get that exchange, and this a pawn is a monster. Very, very hard to stop this a pawn. So after rook takes b6, rook a2, great move. These pieces are very vulnerable, and the back rank is very vulnerable. The bishop moves to e3 here, and the pawn starts its march. a4, rook b7, hitting that bishop, bishop back to e8. And now this rook is trying to create enough counterplay by harassing the bishops and the king to be able to draw the game. Hikaru steps up with king f7, rook b7 check now, and the question is, do you fall back? Well, you can, but the king is still in some trouble here, and Hikaru sees an opportunity, and he goes for it. He plays the daring move, king to e6. This move, really a brilliant move, offers this bishop on g7. As Hikaru himself said while he was streaming this, I'm starting to get tricky. So at this point, Bacrot, not in possession of a lot of time on the clock, did take on g7. That seems like the natural decision because, you know, if you're in a difficult position, your opponent offers you a piece, and you'll be in a difficult position if you don't take the piece. You probably should at least take the piece and make your opponent prove his calculations. Otherwise, you're suffering with low chances to save the game anyway. However, there was an interesting opportunity here that the computer points out. It is rook to b6 check. The idea is to keep checking the king, and ultimately you might have the same decision if the king falls back. But the question is, what happens if the king moves forward here, trying to stay active and permanently dodge the rook checks? Well, this actually would be a mistake and would let Bacrot save the game. This is a good moment to pause your video if you want to figure out the resources available to Bacrot in this position. The key here is g4 check. Beautiful move, really brilliant stuff. First off, when I was looking at this, I was like, okay, well, I can't go king e4 because then a fork, and all right, you win that. And then I realized it's not even a fork. This is actually a checkmate in the center of the board here. Very easy to imagine a player less than Hikaru allowing this kind of checkmate here. So king e4, rook to e6 check, absolute disaster. It makes a lot more sense to play king takes g4, of course, and you might ask, what was the whole point of this? We've just lost a pawn, but now we're not getting mated on the back rank, so that's really useful, of course. And these bishops are still in trouble. In this position, White can actually draw by harassing the bishops here. Rook b8, this bishop and this bishop have no way to arrange themselves to avoid a position where they're getting perpetualed or one is getting lost. And without the back rank problems for this king here, you can't afford to sacrifice a bishop anymore because Bacrot will be able to hold on after he wins a bishop. So very interesting line that didn't happen in the game, because after the king came up to e6, Bacrot did munch the bishop, and this munching of the bishop doesn't work. Rook a1, and this should be a winning position for Hikaru here. You can't play king f1 to defend this knight because of forced checkmate, bishop b5 check, pushing the king back, and then you grab the knight on e1 with checkmate. After rook a1, we get bishop to d2, trying to hold onto the knight, of course, but rook d1, and these pieces cannot both be saved. Pawn g3, making left so the king can at least escape. Rook takes d2. Hikaru's got his piece back, and he's still in possession of a strong pawn and an active rook. Now we get knight to f3. This was actually a mistake, and better was king g2, which is very similar, but after knight f3, rook d1 check, it's important that this rook has just gone to the first rank with a gain of time. After king g2, Hikaru could have put this game away on the spot with the move bishop f7, and this rook cannot stop the a-pawn anymore. If it tries to zig around, the problem is that when it gets here, the rook is on d1, not d2, like if king g2 had been played before knight f3 earlier, and the pawn is just queening on the spot right here. So that's the difference here. Hikaru missed the opportunity to play bishop f7 and just queen this pawn by force, but he's still almost certainly objectively winning the game. He plays g5 here. He's going to march his pawns up the board here and attack this king. And of course, he's still pushing this pawn, and he's even got some dangerous mating net ideas as well. Now, Bacrot says, well, I better stop this pawn. Comes over, rook a7, bishop b5, threatening a forced checkmate, starting with bishop f1. So pawn to h3 to give the king some room to breathe on h2. h5, g4, h4, keeping the king and the knight sealed in over here. Very nice patient stuff. One mate I liked was knight g1 here, when bishop f1 check pushes the king into the corner, because if the king comes out, you have rook to d3 check and mate with a very funny checkmate. So rook to a5 here, harassing the bishop. The bishop moves with check, and the king steps over. Now we attack the knight here, and of course the knight isn't able to move to a lot of squares because this will fall right here. So the knight goes to the only square where it will defend this pawn, but then Hikaru just attacks f2, and there's no way to defend f2 in this position. The king can't access the g file here. So Bacrot goes ahead and takes on a4, nothing better to do, and then rook takes f2 check, king makes its only legal move, and bishop g2 check. And at this point, Bacrot actually resigned the game, and the reason he did that is because it's mate next move, and we know, because I saw on Hikaru's stream him pre-move the next move, that the mate he was picking was not bishop f3, but bishop e4. Of course, it makes no difference. In either case, we see that the king is totally trapped here on h2. A beautiful checkmate and a beautiful, beautiful and challenging game from Hikaru. Thanks to this game, ultimately, the New York Marshals ended up tying their match against the Roosters in regular time. Then it went to overtime, and in overtime, Hikaru ended up having to win the last 3 games to win the match. He did so in a critical final game against Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, when it looked like Vachier-Lagrave was doing okay. Just at the final moment in the game, Vachier-Lagrave lost on time. That 1 second increment can get away if you're not paying attention. And the New York Marshals do win the match and advance in the Pro Chess League playoffs. If you want to see that full broadcast, then click on that video right over on top of the chessboard right over here. Thanks so much, and have a fantastic day.